Welcome to the Women Arise podcast. I'm your host, Neely Hicks, and with me today is John Woodrow Cox. John is an enterprise reporter at the Washington Post and the author of Children Under Fire, An American Crisis. And this book is nominated, it's a finalist actually for the Pulitzer Prize, and has been the recipient of many other awards. So welcome, John. I'm so glad that you could join us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So your book, Children Under Fire, takes a different look at America's gun crisis. So what insight did you gain in following the children survivors of school shootings?
Yeah, so the motivation for the book was really and a lot of my work over the last 5.5 years was to really show people what the experience of gun violence is like through the eyes of children. So much of the reporting around kids and gun violence is told through the perspective of the adults around the kids and not the kids themselves. And what I found certainly is that kids have a lot more to say and a lot more to share about their personal experiences, even when they're quite young. So, the two kids that I followed in the book, who are really the primary subjects of the book, are a little girl in South Carolina named Ava Olson, who was in first grade when a teenager pulled up to her playground and opened fired on a group of first graders and killed her best friend, the boy that she loved. And that shooting only lasted 12 seconds, and it has derailed Ava's life entirely. Nothing about her life now reflects what her life had been before that day. So, that was really incredibly informative experience. That was really the first school shooting I'd ever written about. And what I found is that even though the world had moved on from that shooting really quickly because only one kid died, the media and the public had really moved on, that the effects on those children who had been on that playground and had been in that school were profound, that they were much more significant than I think I would have imagined or that anybody else would have. And that shooting in particular led me to create a database of school shootings dating back to Sandy Hook, or rather to Columbine in 1999. And the primary focus of the database is to track how many children have been on a campus when a school shooting occurred. So the kids who were like Ava and her friends, who weren't physically harmed, but who were present during one of these events. And that number now is more than 320,000 children who've been on a campus since 1999. So, much of the book is trying to convey that the scope of this crisis is much broader than people imagine it to be.
Yes, it is. And it's so important for us to listen to the children, because I think that when someone is faced, whether child or adult, when someone faces an existential crisis, whatever that may be, it's so important for them to be able to verbalize what has happened and what is continuing to happen within. So how has Ava been able to get the support that she needed to recover from the trauma?
She really hasn't. She lives in a pretty rural community. She's at this stage probably been to 10 different therapists, and none of them were really well equipped to deal with the complexity of her trauma. I think that there's a misconception in this country, and that's especially true around school shootings, that any therapy is good enough. Is that, as long as a kid is getting some form of therapy, that they're fine. And that is just not true. It's like anything else. There are people who are specialists in certain things, or who are better at something than someone else is. And certainly in Ava's case, she has just really struggled to find anybody who can help. And the truth is that we don't provide children like her as a society with the help that they need with the money that they need. This is why so often parents in her parents' position sue the schools, and they sue the police, and they sue the shooter's family, because they've realized that they have millions of dollars potentially in therapy over the course of their kid's lifetime to pay for, and they don't have any way to pay for it. So, I spent the summer in Uvalde reporting a story there, and this was a perfect example. I mean, this was one of the most high-profile school shootings in American history. There was, attention from all over the country, and there still is. And the little girl who I was following down there, she was being granted free therapy through a grant. And what free therapy meant was 15 minutes every other week. That was the extent of her therapy. And really, it was just so the powers that be, the state, could say, well, all these kids are getting the support that they need, when in fact they aren't at
Mhm.
all.
Yeah, it's really easy for people to just say, oh, yeah, they're getting free therapy. And then, unless you ask those questions about what does that actually mean, like
Right.
you just assume that everything is going to be all right. And
Hmm.
it's not. And while Ava is one child, how many other children? You said 320,000 children who've been impacted, who've been present at a school during these school
Hmm.
shootings. So, what about them?
Yeah, I mean, we know that a meaningful percentage of those kids will struggle for years with some form of trauma. And, just in that one case in Townville, this was a shooting that lasted 12 seconds, right? It was over very quickly because the gunman, his gun jammed, and it was over. And yet, there were children on the second floor of that school who did not hear the gunfire, who didn't know what was going on, who didn't know the boy who died. And they struggled for many, many months after that event, because suddenly the place where they were meant to, learn and grow and play with their friends was no longer a safe place. That idea of I'm safe here was gone. And, we know, in, studies of hierarchy of needs, that if kids don't feel safe, their ability to do anything else uh, becomes much more difficult. And and the truth is that even that 320,000 figure doesn't begin to capture the real scope, because those are just kids who are affected by school shootings. That doesn't consider the millions of children who are largely black and brown, who live in neighborhoods where gun violence is a perpetual problem. It's chronic. It's not just a one-off event. It's something that occurs every day. And we have the same expectations of those kids, that they're going to be resilient and get past the difficulties. And the truth is that the challenges they face are perpetual. They don't end. And there isn't a bunch of therapists who come in after the fact, and therapy dogs, and millions of dollars poured in from all over the country. These kids are largely left on their own to just figure it out. And it's unfair that we've placed that sort of burden on so many kids in this country.
It absolutely is. And it reminds me of a child that was friends with my daughter. They were both in second grade, and we were living in Ridgeland, Mississippi. And Marissa and her friend Chris would hop in my car after school, and we'd go to the library, and they
Mm-hmm.
would do their homework together. And one day I was sitting across from Chris, and I said, so, Chris, what do you want to be when you grow up? And he just kind of looked at me and said, I figure I'll be shot.
Wow. Yeah.
Second grade. And that
Yeah.
stunned me because, I think of how everything that we do in this life kind of springs forth from a place of either hope or hopelessness. Like,
Hmm.
my life is going to be this, or I don't have a future. This is
Right.
what is going to happen to me. And so instilling and reinstilling that sense of hope throughout life is something that really helps form human beings into what they
Hmm.
can be and to help them live their purpose.
Hmm.
Could you say more about the second student that you followed?
Sure. Yes. Tyshawn McFadder, who really reminds me of the child you just mentioned. Tyshawn grew up mostly in Southeast DC, and when he was in second grade, his father was shot to death outside of his school, just in the middle of the day one day. And it was close enough that Tyshawn could see the police lights from the lobby of the school. But for Tyshawn, unlike Ava, he was really familiar with gun violence by that age. He had nearly been shot himself at a playground once. The first time I walked into his home, the row house that he lived in just up the street from his school, there was a bullet hole his head high, in the front door. And, it had ended up in the back of the TV. So, Tyshawn knew several of his dad's friends who'd been killed. Uh, and so for Tyshawn, it wasn't some sort of faraway hypothetical thing. He knew that gun violence was a constant presence in his community, and then it took his dad's life. And for Tyshawn, it created a huge amount of anger in him and fear. He was really fixated on the person who killed his dad and whether that person was going to come for him. And there was one particular moment that really shifted my perspective on gun violence, and it was there had been this spate of shootings in Tyshawn's neighborhood. There had been, in the span of a week, there had been a half dozen shootings, and his father had been one of those, and he was killed, of course. And so at this charter school, elementary school where Tyshawn attended, they had asked the students there, who only went up to third grade, to draw pictures of what made them sad in their neighborhoods. And I'll never forget, standing in the auditorium of this school, and there's this big board of drawings and in crayon and marker, and they were vivid depictions of violence, of people being shot in the street, of funerals, of grave sites, of blood, of bullets, being fired. And these were not imagined images. These were images taken from lived experiences. And what struck me is that none of these kids were considered victims of gun violence, not legally. So they weren't extended any of the support that victims of gun violence are given in this country. And they were just on their own. Kids who had seen dead bodies, who had lost family members, who'd been shot at themselves. And yet, there was one psychologist in that school. None of the teachers had gone through any kind of trauma informed training. They were just floating. They were just being asked to succeed in an environment that made it, very, very difficult to succeed.
Mhm. A couple of the things that you said really brought up other questions for me. One, when you said that Tyshawn is really angry.
Hmm.
When I was in divinity school at Vanderbilt University, I I learned in pastoral counseling that anger is a sign that something's not right.
Hmm.
And that phrase shifted my outlook on anger because so many times people are just kind of put down for, why are you
Hmm.
so angry?
Right.
But really, it needs to be flipped to what is not right at this
Hmm.
point.
Yeah.
And I think that if we look at the shooters, we then see that they're angry, like something's
Hmm.
not right within them, and yet
Right.
they don't feel like they've got other healthy choices that seem, as an option to prioritize over
Hmm.
violence. So how is Tyshawn doing with working through his anger? Are there things he's doing to cope?
Like Ava's mom, it was a real struggle for Tyshawn to get any kind of therapy, in large part because his mom just couldn't afford it. Very few health insurance policies cover quality mental health care, and so that often leaves these parents on their own to pay for it, and it's exceedingly expensive to get really good mental health care. So Tyshawn is in a good school, and he's got a great support system. His mother is incredibly devoted, and we know that the data tells us that kids who've experienced trauma and have high, what we call ACEs scores, kids who've been through a lot, that the number one thing for them to overcome their circumstances is adults in their lives who love them. And certainly that is true for Tyshawn. I mean, he is a kid who is surrounded by adults in his life who loves him, most importantly his mom. But it's a long road. I mean, he's got a long way to go, and I know that I have a lot of hope, but I know too that it doesn't take much, for a kid, a black child in this country who turns into a teenager, for things to go awry because one word wrong or an interaction with the police or any number of things. The risk for black teenage boys in this country is exceedingly high, especially in neighborhoods like his, for just something to go wrong, even if they're great kids who are doing virtually everything right. So, his mom is doing everything she can to protect him from, kind of ending up in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Mm. Yes, and that it helps to know that he has that one person who is yearning for his well-being, who's right
Mm-hmm.
there walking that path with him. And it really does also take a village. We've got, there's more awareness being raised every day around resiliency and trauma informed. Those are kind of buzzwords right now. And
Mm-hmm.
so what I've been doing with the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors is developing a 7-week program, and we'll have a program for children next year. We'll also have a peer support group model so that people who are in faith communities where Al Anon, Alcoholics Anonymous,
Mm-hmm.
all of those groups currently meet, that we would also have these trauma informed groups that could help someone identify like the felt senses. Where are you
Mm-hmm.
feeling the anxiety? Where are you feeling the grief, the anger? And then help them also learn healthy coping skills. And this is based on a model that's been used for 2 decades in state based institutions, whether they
Mm-hmm.
are juvenile correctional facilities or adult prisons or various mental health programs. And so we've taken that and then put it into a bundle that our listeners can download for free at triumphovertrauma.info. We also have facilitator training online so that anyone who wants to become a facilitator of a group in their local community can do that. But
Mm-hmm.
you can also use it as basic family support.
That's
You can
great.
practice these things together. And so we're trying to mainstream trauma informed care because we
Mm-hmm.
know that there are so few social workers and mental health experts,
Yeah.
and such a lack of health insurance for
Mm-hmm.
mental health care and just access. So we're hoping and believing that we can create more of a circle of care for children like Tyshawn, like Ava, but then
Mm-hmm.
also in my deepest prayer, it's that we could also create a catch net for those children who may become a shooter
Yeah.
because they're not understanding the trauma that's happened in their own lives, and they're not surrounded by that one adult who is
Mm-hmm.
nurturing them into wholeness and healing. So, do you have any words to say around that initiative? Do you think that would help those that you've been following?
Yeah. I mean, I think so much of what is lacking are is just knowledge, right? People being trained to understand what to look for. There's been this shift in the sort of mental health community in the last decade or so from not asking, kids what's wrong with you, but instead asking what happened to you. And I think that, that all speaks to that idea, right? Of I think certainly reaching into these communities to help people understand what it is that they're seeing when a kid is having a hard time or acting out or showing signs of anger could be incredibly useful, because right now people don't know what to do, right? And that's true for teachers too. The teachers on the front lines who are doing the best they can, but many of them, millions of them, don't have any sort of guidance, any sort of training, any sort of background on what it is that their kids are going through and how to handle it and how to handle their own trauma. That is so
Yeah.
often overlooked, is what the teachers themselves are dealing with and what it's like for them to lose students, or for to
Mhm.
watch their students lose parents, and then those teachers to just have to carry on, because they're personally affected as well. So I think, so much of addressing this problem, we know that gun violence is not going to disappear in this country. In our lifetimes, kids are going to continue to be affected by gun violence for uh, decades, forever,
Mhm.
really. And so what that means is that we have to deal with it. We have to try to help the kids who are going to be affected, and there's so much more that we could do.
Mhm. John, I want you to say a bit more about that, because I believe I know at the event here in Nashville at Belmont University recently, you spoke about the numbers that continue to rise year after year in mass shootings. Could you say a word about that?
Sure, yeah. Well, just gun violence in general. Beyond mass shootings, we're now in excess of 40,000 people a year, die from gun violence in some way, and that number will never get to zero, but there are things that we could do now that could save thousands of lives every year. And so if we got to 35 or 30 or 25,000, that would be worth it. Things that could get us there are worth it. And we so often look at this as binary, is that either gun violence is out of control or it goes away. And that's just not the way to look at it. It will never go away. We will never get to zero. But there's some common sense, sort of obvious things that we could do that could save kids' lives. And the one that I always point to is gun owners just need to lock up their firearms. It is such an obvious and easy thing to do that wouldn't deprive gun owners of access to whatever guns they want to own. But a lot of a lot of people in this country, the only form of gun violence they care about is school shootings. And what I tell those people is, if fine, if you don't care about the Tyshans of the world, fine. If the only thing you care about is school shootings, then consider this one statistic. That's, if since Columbine, if the one thing America had changed was that every gun owner locked up the firearms that they had, nearly 60% of school shootings would not have happened. And that's still true today. If gun owners just locked up their guns today, nearly 60% of school shootings just would stop. They would just end overnight. It is such a simple thing. And beyond that, a huge number of young people who kill themselves, who take their own lives, would not die. They would not take their own lives. People think that suicide is this thing that has nothing to do with the method, that if someone doesn't have access to a firearm, then they will cut their wrists, or they'll hang themselves, or they'll jump off a bridge. And that's simply untrue. Is that the data has shown us over and over that access to a specific form of lethal means has a huge amount to do with whether or not someone goes through with it. And we know too that a huge percentage of young people who attempt suicide do so within 5 minutes of the very first time they've considered taking their own life. So if that young person has access to a gun, it's extremely unlikely they're going to survive. If they don't have access to a gun, it is likely that they will survive. So, and then things like kids who accidentally shoot themselves, who accidentally shoot their parents and their neighbors and their siblings, all those things would go away if we just did this one thing. It is,
Mhm.
in my mind, kind of the low hanging fruit of gun safety reform.
Yes, that's so important. And I believe there were two other things that you mentioned alongside the locking up of guns.
So the other two, obvious things that my years of reporting really support is universal background checks. We know that, people often complain about, they look at cities like DC or Chicago and they say, well, those cities have strict gun laws, and yet there's a lot of gun violence. So this must mean that gun laws don't work. And, the problem, the fallacy in that thinking is that, America doesn't have closed borders. When someone wants to sell a bunch of weapons on the streets of DC, they can just drive over to Virginia. Historically, they can just drive over to Virginia, go to a gun show where there are no background checks. They can, buy a bunch of guns. They can use straw buyers to purchase a bunch of guns, and then they can just drive back over to DC and sell those on the streets, because there's no one at the DC border who is stopping cars when they drive into town to check their trunk for, the 300 guns they've just bought. So we know that universal background checks would not end the black market of guns, but it would make a dent. It would absolutely save lives. That's an obvious thing we could do. And then, maybe the most significant thing that we need to do is research gun violence, gun safety. These are things that we need to research. For 25 plus years, the CDC did not research gun violence. And this was a political decision motivated by one member of Congress in the 1990s. And that has set us back decades. So, we can't know what would fix it, what could make guns safer, what could stop gang violence and things like that, or curb gang violence, without actually researching it. But we haven't done that for political reasons for a very long time. Only in the last few years has Congress started to fund that research again. But we're decades behind. So in the same way that we've made great strides in car safety, it's the reason we have medians with cement medians in the road. It's the reason we have airbags. It's the reason that we have so much technology around car safety. We could do that very same thing with guns. We could apply that same logic to gun safety. We just haven't done it yet. So until we research it to understand what it is that will work, we're going to always sort of exist in the dark, and both sides are going to be guessing about what would work. And you're going to have one side saying, well, what we need to do is just arm all the teachers, and you're going to have people on the other side saying, well, we just need to ban all the guns. And neither of those ideas are backed by good data, because we haven't taken the time to and invested the money to actually research it. So I think that's really where the solution begins.
Mm. Thank you so much, John, for giving me this time. I know that people will want to check out your book, Children Under Fire. I encourage you not only to buy the book, but to also download the book discussion guide, which we will have available through triumphovertrauma.info. Lynn Hetty and her husband, Ron, put together a great book discussion guide that is free to use in your community group. John, thank you so much. And I pray that God continues to bless you to
Thank you.
look at the hard things in life and bring light to them so that they can heal. That's the way to provide
Yeah.
healing, is to bring the light. Thank you
Well,
so
thank you so
much,
much.
John.
Thank you for having me.